Hey, good morning to everybody. Happy Friday. It's Daryl here. It is bright and freaking early, man. It's 3 a.m. here in Connecticut on the East Coast. Okay, I've seen this story about the three Kansas City Chiefs fans that passed an untimely passing, and I've seen this story for about a week or two now. And I've been kind of skimming over it. I've told you guys before I'm not a sports fan. This isn't really a sports story, but it never really caught my attention until today. And there's an update on this story. I'm going to read you the update and what's going on in this story. And sometimes when I read, I go through all these news feeds in the morning to find something to talk about on my YouTube channel. And I know right away when I find the story because I'll read an article and all of a sudden I'll be like, oh my God, I remember this happened. It relates to my life. It relates. All of a sudden I remember this incident and that incident. That's exactly like what I'm reading. And it's like, oh my God, I got to talk about this. The purpose of this video is absolutely not to glorify drug use or recreational drug use or anything like that. Recovery is possible. I've been clean and sober since October 23rd of 2006, over 17 years clean and sober, completely clean and sober. And I was a hardcore heroin and crack addict, full-blown junkie crackhead, using constantly for over 2 decades. So I got an idea of what I'm talking about here. When I read this article this morning, all of a sudden it occurred to me that what's going on now wasn't happening back when I was using. And I almost thought about, as when I read this article, I almost thought about not an apology, but kind of backpedaling on some of what I've been talking about. Because when I've been talking about fentanyl, and I keep saying that the problem isn't the fentanyl, isn't the southern border. The problem is addiction. Nobody's twisting these people's arms to use these drugs. People, when there's a supply, there's a demand. The problem, you take away fentanyl, and believe me, it's just going to be something else. And then when I read this article, I realized back 17 years ago, this was not around. I mean, there was fentanyl patches. I remember fentanyl patches just starting to pop up and people messing around how to extract the drug from them. And but that was really it. And as I read this article, I realized I could see exactly what happened. I could picture the scenario perfect. Because it happened dozens of times, the same kind of gathering. I went through these gatherings dozens of times back when I was using. All right, let me describe it to you. Like I said, these three Kansas City Chiefs fans were found in the backyard. And it says in this article, it's kind of harsh. It says the family was told that they had to wait until the bodies thawed until they could come identify them. The 3 bodies were found in the backyard. Now, the guy who owned this house, they all gathered to watch a Kansas City Chiefs game, all these guys. And the guy that owned the house apparently has moved out of the house and checked himself into rehab. His name is Jordan Willis. And like I said, as I read this story, I was like, oh my God, I know what happened. It reminds me of situations that I went through. Okay, so these guys disappeared for a few days, and eventually they were found frozen in the backyard. And the initial toxicology has come back, and they found cocaine and fentanyl in these guys' systems. So, like I said, I could picture a lot of times, dozens of times back when I was younger. Usually I was the party guy. I hate to say this, but I was usually like the Jordan Willis. I was the guy that had the party house. I was the guy that had the connections. I was the guy that was always using. And a lot of times I hate to say that. I hate to be to identify with the bad guy in this story, but that's really who I was most of the time. And when there was, like a stag or a sporting event or whatever, where guys get away from their girlfriends, their wives, their families, and they say, hey, it's a guy's night out. We're going to go hang out. And usually, a lot of times, I was the guys, the house that they would go to because I had the party favors and all that. And these guys would usually, they would use on the sly from their girlfriends. I remember doing this too, though. I remember using on the sly. I remember having a girlfriend, and she didn't, she, of course, she would have never approved of me using. I remember going out and using crack one night, or several nights, and we would test it out. I was in my train. I had a Trans Am, a 79 Trans Am back then, and we would test it out before we bought it. The dealer would run up to the window, and we take the cigarette lighter. I don't even know if cars have cigarette lighters anymore. And we push the cigarette lighter in, and it would pop out red and hot. And we take a little piece, a little rock, and drop it in there. And if it was the real deal, it would, it would sizzle and melt, and you'd smell the cracks. It was a quick test to make sure we didn't buy bunk. We didn't get burnt. Okay, so this happened. Then a couple days later, weekend, I'm out with my girlfriend, and she smoked cigarettes, and she pushed a lighter in and pulled it out. And all of a sudden, I remember about what testing this stuff. And she pulls it out, and she goes to light her cigarette, and all I could smell, I see the leftover crack smoke just billowing up in the air. And she puts it up to her cigarette and starts lighting it. And I'm like, oh my God, here it comes. She's gonna break up with me. She's gonna freak out. And I don't know what happened. I still wonder to this day, because she didn't say a word, and she knew what it smelled like. So it makes me wonder if she was using on the sly for me too. I still don't know what happened that day. But these are some of the stories that this reminds me of. Okay, like I said, a lot of times guys would get away from their girls, their families, a guy's night out, and they would use, somebody would have a little packet of cocaine or whatever, and they would use. And when I read this story, I thought to myself, these guys probably weren't looking for fentanyl at all. So somebody in the crowd probably had a little cocaine, and they might have been rock. You can't tell in toxicology. You can't tell if it's crack, if they smoked a crack rock, or if they did lines. You can't, it could be either or. It's both comes back as cocaine in the system. You can't tell the difference. And maybe with more intricate tests, you might be able to spot baking soda or something else they cut it with, but usually you can't tell. But anyway, I realized that these guys, like I was saying in other videos, that it's these guys, it's the people's fault, because they went and asked dealers for the fentanyl. I got the fentanyl. So I was almost ready to apologize and backpedal in this video, because I realized these guys didn't, they got something they weren't expecting. But then I really can't do that, because once again, these guys, basically they put something up their nose they knew they shouldn't. I did that hundreds of times, and luckily I'm still here. But I have a hard time blaming Mexico or Colombia or cartels or whatever for situations like this. Because like I said, nobody twisted these guys' arms. They knew better than to do this. And they did it anyway. And this is what happens. And it happens sometimes when you do things you're not supposed to. They knew better, and they did it anyway. That's my opinion on this. There's one other story that this reminds me of, one other night, and this was a horrific night, one of the worst nights of my life, where I was actually accused of murder. I was asked if I murdered somebody. I showed up at I showed up at a party house late, because I'd run out of money. I was using on my own. I was far into my addiction at this point, so I would just buy and I would go off and use on my own. And I ran out of money. I ran out of drugs. So at that point, I went to go find other people to use their drugs. So I went to a house I knew where people were usually at, and my friends were there using. I went in and I tried to, they knew I was broke. They knew, I was just there to use them. And I tried to, squeeze in there, and they didn't, they weren't having it. They weren't sharing anything with me. And I remember seeing them use right in front of me, and I was getting angry that they weren't sharing with me. And I remember seeing two of my friends go in the bathroom, and I knew they were using heroin. And I wanted the crack. I wanted these people to share the crack with me, and they were using it right in front of me. And I ended up getting angry. And the two guys came out of the bathroom, and we all were out standing in the driveway. And one of the guys that was in the bathroom, all of a sudden, just his eyes started rolling back in his head. and he starts sliding. He starts falling down, like sliding down a car. He's leaning against the car, on his back against the car, and he just starts sliding down the car. And one of my friends looked at me and said, "Hey, how come your dope doesn't do that? Like, look at this. Our dope is so much better." Like they're teasing me. They're busting my ass, saying, look how good. Look at the good stuff we have. Ha ha. And so I just had enough at that point. I got in my car and I drove away. I was the last one there, the first one to leave. I was probably there for an hour. I later found out that guy fell on the ground and died right there in the driveway. He's somebody I went to school with. He's somebody I went to concerts with. He was a good friend of mine. To this day, I still think if I had known what was happening, I could have, I could have thrown him in my car. I don't know why nobody didn't throw them in their car and drive to the hospital, but nobody did. Instead, what these guys did is they went to his pockets, took all his money, took his car keys, and propped him up on a couch in front of the house and left and never came back. 3 days later, they found my friend still sitting on the couch, passed away. And they all turned on me because I was the last one there. I was the odd man out. And they said it must have been Daryl that shared it with him because he used heroin a lot. So it was probably him that did it. So the police called me in and I was completely upfront and honest with them. I told them just what I'm telling you guys, And I still remember the cop jumping over the table and looking me right in the eye and saying, "Did you do this, Daryl? Did you kill him? Did you effing kill him?" I told him, I said, "I'll take a lie detector test or whatever, a polygraph." And of course, I was cleared of this, but this is the kind of people, and these are the people that I consider my friends, my friends, the closest people to me. Most of these people have moved out of state. One of these main guys, because the cops took me out of the room then, and they said, "Daryl, we know you're telling the truth because everybody's saying the same story except for one guy, one of my friends." And, he was the guy that came up with the idea to take all this guy's money in his car. And, the cops said, everybody's telling the same story except for this one guy. And I don't think he moved out of state. He moved to North Carolina. And one day we ended up friending each other on Facebook not too long ago. Remember, this was like 20 years ago. And so I friended him. I said, let bygones be bygones. Not only was he an accomplice in one of my friends passing away, but he said it was my fault when I had nothing to do with it. And so I ended up friending him on Facebook. Let bygones be bygones. And then one day he sent me a private message. And he said, "Hey, you remember so-and-so? Remember what happened that day?" And I couldn't believe that he was, do I remember this? Yeah, I remember it. I remember the cops calling me in because of what you said. And I got so angry, I unfriended him right there from Facebook. I've never talked to him since then. I couldn't believe he had the audacity. He's probably feeling guilty for what he did, not only to the other guy, but for blaming me for it. This is what friends do, the people you use with. A lot of times guys get away from their girlfriends or their families, and they go out and do things they shouldn't. And that happens a lot. It might happen with girls too. I don't know, but I remember seeing it dozens of times when I was a younger guy. And I'm thankful now that I don't have to lie about anything. There's nothing I do these days that I'm ashamed of or I have to lie about. There's nothing I do, nothing I say, nowhere I go that I have to lie about. I can be completely honest about everything I do these days. And it's a great life. Clean and sober since October 23rd, 2006. Recovery is possible. My heart is with these three men's families. I don't mean to cast aspersions on these three men, but I'm just relating the stories. When I read this article, these things popped right into my mind. Similar situations that happened back when I was using. Recovery is possible. You guys have a good Friday.